This documentary seeks to present the meaning of Islamophobia, how did it emerge, who are responsible of its occurrence, what are the manifestations of Islamophobia. It also discusses the role of Muslims in dealing with Islamophobia. Based on the research and work of the subject matter experts, IKIM had the privilege to involve namely Dr. Hisham Halia and Dr. Hatim Bazian, together with inputs from the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, the Honorable Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. All three speakers have contributed to the IKIM colloquium on demystifying Islamophobia.
Ladies and gentlemen, the term Islamophobia has been popularized to mean anti-Muslim racism found in Western societies. The primary purpose is to promote prejudice against or hatred of Islam and Muslims. In Malaysia, online hate against Islam can be understood as a reaction against ultra-conservative displays of Islam that are perceived to be constricting the multicultural public sphere and discriminatory to non-Muslims. It has been reported that there were a series of social media postings insulting the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that led to numerous police reports. Several countries utilize the global discourse on terrorism to implement authoritarian policing against the Muslims.
Islamophobia is no doubt a popular phrase that is used by everybody now, and it has been taken as an accepted concept without critical analysis on its true meaning. But what is the meaning of Islamophobia? Who actually first coined it? It is very important for us to know its true definition and the context in which this term emerged in order for us to understand the real issue concerning Islamophobia.
It is easy perhaps to lay the blame on other people for whatever happens, whatever bad things happen to us. But often it is not fair to blame everyone else and not to look at oneself too. We need to know what we have done which has contributed to the subject being Islamophobia, fear of Islam. We know this is a term that has come into use quite some time now, and it is taken as an expression of the fear of Islam and Muslims in the world. Obviously, it was not invented or coined by Muslims. It was invented and coined by those who do not like Muslims, who are in fact enemies of the Muslims and of Islam.
And most Islamophobes are not afraid, actually, of Islam. And we give them an excuse for their bigotry by claiming as such. Rather, they're opposed to it. They suspect it, they hate it, they want to restrict it, and so on. And even though fear may play into the many emotions that are instrumentalized by Islamophobes, it's not about fear. It's about quite a few other things. There have been a series of definitions proposed for Islamophobia over the years. And I find the ones that are proposed by practitioners, by those who engage with policy, to be of particular note in that regard, because such definitions are aimed at informing policy and thus law. The definition proposed by the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, was as follows, and I quote, "Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness." Another proposed definition, again from within the UK context, and again actually from a practitioner, is, and I quote, "any incident/criminal offense which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a Muslim faith or perceived Muslim faith.
Islamophobia is a structural organizing principle that sits at the present racial crossroads and employed to rationalize and extend the dominant global power alignment while embarking on a project for silencing the collective global other. I define Islamophobia in Muslim-majority countries as a political, social, economic, military, cultural, and religious process emerging out and shaped by the colonial Eurocentric hegemonic discourses dating to late 18th century, constituted and internalized through an imitative project by post-colonial elites that posited itself or was designated by Western powers as the custodian for the modern secular, nationalist, and progressive Muslim nation-state project. Islamophobia, in terms of a visual summary of what we actually see, there's prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and violence.
As observed and stated by the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Hatim Bazian, and Dr. Hisham Halia, the notion Islamophobia refers to certain attitude and perspective towards Islam and the Muslims, and it has become a phenomenon in places where Muslims are the minority. As for the Muslim majority countries, they are not necessarily experiencing this phenomenon, but its residues and effects surely disruptive. As for how Islamophobia emerged in history, let us proceed to the following section.
At the time of the Prophet in Medina, there was already antagonism between Muslims and the Jews. But the Jews were not very numerous, and they were unable to fight a war against Muslims. So their tendency was to bide their time by not incurring the displeasures of the Muslims. Later on, we find that there were other conflicts between Islam and Christendom, but these did not result in a general impression that Islam and Muslims are to be feared. They are not, the term Islamophobia was not coined at that time. It is much later that we hear this word being coined and being used. And this has direct connection with the injustice perpetrated on the Muslims, particularly in Palestine.
The first use or the first emergence of the term of Islamophobia actually comes in the early period of the French colonial engagement in North Africa, where the understanding is that Islamophobia is the inimical attitude or perspective toward Islam and Muslims. Also for individuals who read the work of Frantz Fanon on the wretched of the earth and his writings on race and racial configuration can identify that much of his work was based on looking at the experience of Algerians and the experience of Muslims under French colonialism. Move forward to Edward Said introducing the term in the late 1970s with Orientalism, and we could actually trace the genealogy to point that it has actually been used to provide the rationalization for violence and mass violence against Muslims. Most recent of it, I would say that both the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq have used a particular notion of Islamophobia to try to actually get support for those two invasions, and they have actually resulted in the death and destruction of two states. And then if we look at the debates and the discourse around Syria, Yemen, Libya, and so on, it is not far away from looking and seeing the footprints of Islamophobic discourse that give credence to this.
The bigotry that Muslims face are not based on people asking them religious questions and being upset about the answers. It's based on people identifying them as being part of a particular group by their appearance and attacking them accordingly. But there are networks that exist that frankly are not interested in radicalization and extremism. They're interested in promoting Islamophobia. And they feed this into how we very often unconsciously engage in bias, how we unconsciously do racial profiling, because somebody somewhere has consciously thought about it. And now we see this phenomenon at the heart of far-right extremism and white identity movements. And those movements don't have anything to do with Muslim extremism or Islamist extremism. They have everything to do with their own insecurities about themselves. Within the UK, and maybe I can put these two things slightly together, the way in which Islamophobia has developed has two critical factors to it. One is about race, which means basically color, okay? And the second is about class.
So again, it also disrupts local politics. In a sense, that's the whole notion of draining the swamp is a metaphor that is used likewise in the domestic political arena. Another point, war on terror. The United States now, as a part of the counter-terror war, involves 39% of the world countries. As a direct result of the fighting of or the projecting of an open-ended war on terror, the United States actually increased its footprint around the globe. Another critique in here. Muslim states and Arab states have embraced the war on terror epistemic. Almost every state have actually taken onto a different modality of the Patriot Act. So the Patriot Act becomes the state policy. So you might oppose the framing of Muslims as the paradigmatic terrorists, but you accepted the epistemic infrastructure that actually posit the otherization of Muslims. So we have to be very careful that the language we use does not actually give the walking feet for this discourse that has been problematized both in the Western world but across the globe. The notion of America first and the role of this type of politics of targeting and demonization. The targeting of Muslims is the new chapter of a long history in America, and I would argue it's a long history in Europe. I wrote a piece, and I said, does Europe have an Inquisition problem? Because during the Inquisition, Muslims could not dress in their Muslim garb. They could not pray. They had to keep their doors open. They had to consume alcohol and pork in the open to demonstrate that they no longer are holding their halal, and also apply to the Jewish population as well, that they're not keeping kosher. If you follow the trajectory of that current discourse in Europe of limitation on hijab, limitation on the building of mosques, yes, there is tolerance, but again, tolerance is one level. Is there inclusion and acceptance on an equal footing? Again, this is part of the discourse. America first, the KKK unleashed a reign of terror against African Americans. Contrary to popular opinion, the height of lynching in the United States occurs after the Civil War. The height of lynching in the United States takes place after the Civil War. From 1876 to 1950, approximately 4,000 lynchings in 12 southern states. Lynching was a political terror campaign against African Americans to contest their rights for political opportunity, their right to land, their part of social capital, as well as religious sites. That's why many campaigns of terror against African Americans targeted their churches, because the church was a symbol of the collective empowerment of African Americans. So lynching was an attempt to put the blacks in their space post the Civil War. Again, Equal Justice Initiative and New York Times. Another thing, also during the same time period, we have the Chinese Exclusionary Act in America. And the Chinese were targeted with lynching likewise. In LA, Los Angeles, which we often represent as being this liberal progressive, actually had witnessed the massacre of 17 Chinese men, and it was completely suppressed for quite a long period of time. Much of the immigration laws in the United States were written on the back of the Chinese and during the Chinese Exclusionary Act period. And this is at a time there was a recession, economic downturn in the late 1870s, and the Chinese were targeted as competing with whites, and a systematic reign of terror that was targeting the Chinese. There was another massacre in Wyoming, September 2nd, 1885, Rock Springs massacre that had in all 28 Chinese were killed, 15 wounded, and all of 70 of their shacks and houses were completely destroyed. Again, if you read normative American history in schools, this is actually almost completely erased.
All speakers agree that the phenomenon of Islamophobia emerges from a certain historical and present-day context in places where Muslims are the minority. As for who is responsible for Islamophobia, let us proceed with the following snippets from the colloquium.
The Western press, largely owned by Jews, played on these acts of terror and named it and said that it has created fear of Islam. And so the word Islamophobia came into being and is now frequently used and directed at Muslims as if all Muslims were terrorists. But the fact remains that there were acts of terror on the parts of Muslims which are not directed at soldiers of Israel or even at Israel. Many of the acts were in other places, and the idea of using such methods to achieve their objective has been taken up by other Muslim organizations, and we are now living in fear that at any time some fanatical person might use these terror tactics in order to vent their anger and frustration.
When one reads the reports published by the Center for American Progress, we see sufficient evidence to prove that actually there are huge networks of foundations and individuals that promote the work of anti-Muslim bigotry across the United States and beyond. And all too often, Muslim communities there are subject to another type of Islamophobia from power in the West, which is to say they're subjected to the, quote-unquote, bigotries of low expectations, end quote. It's a bigotry that means that we consider that autocratic regimes are described as natural or bad but necessary.
Now going to ideological driving force. If you're dealing with Islamophobia today, you have to know that the central, one of the central pieces of literature is the Huntington thesis, the Clash of Civilization, which again is based on the work of Bernard Lewis, who problematized Islam and Muslims as Orientalists per excellence. And then, following the Clash of Civilization, Huntington wrote, Who Are We?, which actually said that the Latino population in America is basically the major threat to the American society. He said, to be an American, you need to accept that America is a white, settler, Anglo-Saxon Christian society. Right? That's his thesis in Who Are We, in his book, saying that the Latino population have to accept. Now notice the Latino are Catholic. They're non-white, they're non-Anglo-Saxon in this sense. So again, in Clash of Civilization, which I will get to, he posited one threat, and then Who Are We begins to be that. So that actually provides the ideological grounding for many of those who are really pushing Islamophobia. These are called Clash of Civilization warriors. Edward Said pointed out that this is a clash of ignorance thesis, because the fact that you have books and its publication doesn't mean that the thesis itself is valid. But again, it has become almost a mainstay of many of those who are positing. Now, important, what Huntington writes on page 20, He said, unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. Again, this is not me speaking, right? Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. So basically, the clash of civilization foundation is actually hate.
While the former Prime Minister suggested that while the Western press owned largely by the Jews were responsible for perpetuating the fear towards Islam and the Muslims themselves made it possible when acts of terror are undertook by Muslims to achieve certain political goals. This was affirmed by Dr. Hisham Halia when he indicated that Islamophobia is fueled by a huge network or foundation of individuals that promote the work of anti-Muslim bigotry, while Dr. Hatim Bazian pinpointed those associated with far-right extremism, Zionist groups, and those who subscribe to the ideology of clash of civilization are those responsible for Islamophobia. Following from this, how then is Islamophobia manifested?
And at least in my own work, I see the following 4 types of anti-Islam sentiment, and they're all quite different. The first is Islamophobia in the United States, directed at Muslims by non-Muslims. The second is Islamophobia in Europe, directed at Muslims by non-Muslims. There's Islamophobia in the West, more generally, directed at Muslims abroad in non-Western Muslim communities. And there's anti-Muslim sentiment or anti-Islam sentiment in Muslim communities by Muslims. And I want to examine this very carefully. As we look at the situation of Islamophobia in Europe today, it is not, and this is even more concerning, it is not that there's an extremist movement that is on the rise that comes from white supremacy and white nationalism. Rather, it's actually more problematic than that. Many of the sentiments and discourse of white supremacy have become, frankly, utterly mainstreamed. So much so that very deeply bigoted anti-Muslim sentiment becomes, as a friend of mine in the House of Lords says, acceptable dinner party conversation. It's past the dinner party test. It's past the dinner table test, where you can say these sorts of things and the room doesn't shut down in the way that it would shut down if discussions were made about blacks or Jews or other groups. And this is the deeply worrying thing, whereas a decade ago, many of these same deeply bigoted discourses were being had by only those on the far right. They've now become part of mainstream discourse.
Framing of Islam and public discourse, Bush framing of Islam is peace in 2001, Trump's unequivocal declaration, I think Islam hates us. A second part, fear. Islamophobia is monetizing fear for votes. Now, this pie chart comes from the FBI, not from Dr. Bazian, not from the Islamophobia Studies Center. This is the FBI looking at all terrorism cases from 1980 to 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Terrorism cases that are attributed to Muslim, Islamic terrorism is approximately 4%. Now, what we know is that media coverage of Muslim-related or terrorism that is committed by Muslims are 600%. So when a Muslim commits an act, media representation of that is 600% someone else. Not only in the US, but also in Europe, in the UK. Perpetrators of each terrorist incident on UK soil from 1980 to September 2014. What do we have in relation to Islamic terrorism? 4%. The primary threat in the UK has been the Irish separatist terrorism. But you actually go into discussions with media personnel, they will see a Muslim behind every threat. Again, I mentioned that Islamophobia intensified as President Obama ran for election. So that ushered into a changing demographic, a changing set of societal occurrences that for those who have historically been accustomed to be in the driver's seat, that became a sense of unease. And we actually see this unease as immediately after Obama got elected, we had the highest rate of gun purchasing taking place among a large segment of the white society in the United States. So Obama's election ushered that there is a changing picture of America, and those who wanted to have a imagined America of the past mobilized heavily, and they actually successfully in the 2010 election were able to win back the House and the Senate as a result of that dynamic.
As we can see by now, the nature of the problem of Islamophobia is systemic. It is interconnected with a host of other problems. What then is the role of the Muslims in tackling this problem? And more generally, what is the solution?
What needs to be done is to recognize the reasons for this act of terror. But the Europeans and Americans who back Israel refuses to discuss the reasons for these acts of terror. Obviously, the reason is the frustration that these people feel over their inability to regain their homeland. They had been forced out of their homeland without compensation. Their property has been seized and is taken by Israelis without any compensation being paid to the owners. If we do not recognize the reasons for their acts, which we call the acts of terror, then it will continue and it will become worse as more and more people become angry and frustrated and unable to fight a conventional war would resort to what we call acts of terror. And of course, this will result in Islam and Muslim being condemned and being the cause of fear felt by the whole world. As I said, we need to know the reasons why. And the reasons lies in the expropriation of Palestinian land to form the state of Israel and the subsequent oppression of Israelis on the people of Palestine. Many were the acts of terror and illegal acts that are committed by Israel, which are not condemned by the big powers. And certainly nothing is done by them to stop Israel from committing these acts. And there is nothing that the Muslim can do because we are all very weak. The better thing to do is to gain the sympathy of the world by showing that the Israelis are the perpetrators of injustice against the Muslim. We need to have more people to support the struggles of the Muslim, using diplomacy and other means to win over the support of many people. It is not true that all Europeans are or Americans are against Islam or the Muslims or against the Palestinian. Many are sympathetic. What is needed is to have a proper strategy in order to win as much support for Islam and the Muslims from the people who today are seemingly afraid of Islam. We need, of course, to explain the teachings of Islam.
It is very clear for the reflective Muslim that we need to look at the root cause of the problem instead of merely the symptoms. Indeed, if Muslims themselves do not have a more profound understanding of their own religion, they are bound to be drawn into more conflict and chaos instead of justice and harmony, which is what those who want to see Muslim to feel want to see. On the other hand, this does not mean Muslims should abandon their communal duties, the fard kifaya. Rather, they should continuously increase their fard ain in the intellectual and ethical sense, which will further strengthen the fard kifaya pursuits and hence truly empowering the ummah.
As I wrap up, I'd like to give some thoughts to some solutions or recommendations in this regard. The first is that cultural capital of Muslims, not simply within the West, but more internationally, that's not simply a luxury, but that's necessary. Cultural capital is necessary. Building cultural capital is incredibly important. And embedding that within the discourse of Muslims more generally is what we will be able to, is what should be focused upon. And embedding the intellectual tradition of Muslims in order for them to realize this, I think, will be very important as well. The embracing of a citizenship rights model, okay, not simply within Muslim communities, but internationally and worldwide, I think, again, is something that will strengthen the resilience of communities more generally and enable them to push back against the phenomenon of Islamophobia. The question is often asked, what Muslim governments should do. And I think there's more than enough for them to do when it comes to the worst examples of Islamophobia, such as the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, which are the worst examples by far. But we should also push for more understanding about how Islamophobia structurally works. We should push for more understanding about how other types of bigotry works against minorities of other faiths and other groups, including among ourselves. That kind of intersectionality of solidarity, including against other Muslim groups that are not necessarily the same as ourselves, so Sunnis versus Shi'is and vice versa. We need to make sure that our own leaders within Muslim communities are not held from criticism or immune from criticism in this regard. Again, we should never allow autocrats or authoritarians to use appeals to quote-unquote Islamic solidarity in order to escape criticism of themselves. When it comes to media, I think it's incredibly important that we train people more effectively, not simply to build alternative media, I think that that's important, but actually I would focus tremendously on training people to go into mainstream media, because as much as we want to try to build alternative media without having a corresponding effort with regard to existing media, I don't think it's going to be very effective. And there are ways in which we can do that.
Well, I think there are many different initiatives that I would recommend. One is actually we need to take Islamic education seriously and to rethink our curriculum, rethink our pedagogy and how we approach it. That is very, very important undertaking. I think we need to develop cooperative relationship among Muslims, both at state level but also among societies, because our problems are collective rather than individually based. We need to incentivize investment in good approaches to problem solving, both economics and otherwise, and I think that is very critical. Lastly, I think what we need is to develop relations with communities that face similar circumstances like us, or Muslims and other communities that are facing these challenges. We need to develop a new conceptualization of what a good society looks like and offer our contribution on a table in essence, to exchange views and understanding. And I think those are the elements that can lead us forward to address the needs of the Muslim community. I did actually earlier articulate the 10 principles for Muslims in terms of engagement, and what are these principles that are rooted in our tradition, and we should put them in conversation with others because the problems we face are collective problems, they're not isolated problems, and therefore it requires multidimensional engagement with Muslims as well as with their neighbors, other faith communities, and in such a way to resolve the issues that are facing us.
In sum, we should be mindful that while we can attribute the phenomenon of Islamophobia to ignorance of Islam and Muslims in places where Muslims are the minority, it is also a deliberate demonization program advanced by certain groups with affiliation to extremist ideologies and the myth of clash of civilization. In other words, it is a systemic challenge. It is interconnected with a host of other problems, including extremism within the Muslim community. To move forward, Muslim decision makers, policy makers, scholars, researchers, academics, and the teachers should be more aware of this challenge in order that Muslims can play a more proactive role in promoting dialogue between civilizations, in advancing a more intelligent discourse, and in reforming our education system in light of demonization efforts, as well as the misunderstanding on Islam and the Muslims in the present day. Therefore, it is imperative that there be more coordinated efforts between leaders, scholars, institutions, and organizations if we are to be more effective in complementing each other's strength towards addressing the systemic challenges we are facing collectively, including this challenge of misunderstanding towards Islam and its demonization efforts from certain groups. The only way forward is to act together with wisdom and intelligence instead of reactively in an ad hoc and isolated manner. The Institute of Islamic Understanding Malaysia, IKIM, welcomes more partners to work with us in this regard.